Welcome to this video. We are talking this week about how to make really interesting podcast episodes. This is going to be as applicable for you if you're trying to be a really interesting podcast guest or a really interesting podcast host. Either way, you're contributing to making an interesting episode. So the tip I'm sharing today, which I think about all the time since I first heard it, I think is so relevant and useful. And here's where I got it from. I was watching a animated short film called The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse last year. It won an Oscar. It's a beautiful short film that's based on a children's book. It's animated. It's so delightful and heartwarming. And in that short film, one of the characters says, being honest is always interesting. And the second I heard that in the film, I was like, that is so smart and profound for life, but for podcasters, being honest is always interesting. And here's what I mean. Think about the stories you remember that you've heard on podcasts. Think about the episodes you remember. Think about the moments when you heard someone say something and you just sank into you and you were like, whoa, and you thought about it and you talked about it and you shared it. That person was being honest. Maybe they were explaining some mind-blowing concept or sharing some really cool fact, but more than likely they were telling a story of lived experience and they were being honest. Because honesty is so relatable and it speaks to like our inner being and we recognize it when it's real honesty. So that could be when you tell stories about how you learned what you learned or experiences you've gone through, transformations, the highs and the lows, right? Peaks and valleys, like these stories that we love and remember. Being honest when you tell those, like really speaking into like what you were feeling, what you were thinking, what the circumstances were, like the decisions you had to make and how it made you feel and how you got through it. That is so interesting. It can also apply to when you're talking about maybe really good advice or wisdom you've learned or a concept that you're sharing on a show and you're super honest about like what it means. Because sometimes when you share a brilliant thing that you've discovered or that you know to be true for your life, you can kind of just gloss over it, or you can really sit with it and be like, let's unpack this. Because it might make us feel a little uncomfortable. It might be, speaking to our ego, or it might bring up some stuff from our past, or it might trigger an insecurity. And let's like unpack this. Being honest is always interesting. Now, there is a caveat to this, and we've talked about this on other episodes. It is super important to have appropriate boundaries on what you share in certain contexts. And that goes for podcasting. Podcasting is a very public arena that anyone can listen to. And so you want to be thoughtful about the boundaries of how honest you are, in the sense that there is just no good reason to share something that's too vulnerable or too sensitive or too personal in a public format like a podcast. Like, have respectful boundaries around how much you share. And within those boundaries, be honest. Because if you try to present as something that you're not, more or less than, if you try and either like cover up how great you are or make yourself seem better than you are, if you try to gloss over what it really took from you or someone else in a story, or if you kind of glide over the things that you think aren't as glamorous and you just share what you think is noteworthy or attractive, makes you look good, it's really not interesting, right? How many people have we heard talk on shows and you're just like, not even memorable, because you're just like, well, this person's just kind of full of themselves, or they have it all figured out, or they just talk in abstract concepts that have no real vulnerability or relatability. That's the opposite of how to make a really interesting episode. Be honest. It's always interesting. I'll give you one example that I think about all the time because she was so honest in an appropriate level of context. Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx, one of the youngest female self-made billionaires in the country, has been on so many podcasts, told this story so many times, but I first heard it on a podcast that I was producing and it totally stuck with me. She, if you've never heard her tell the story of how she created this amazing empire, she was selling fax machines in Clearwater, Florida for years, like door to door, just like such a beatdown of a job. People slamming the door in her face, just treating her terrible. And she just had this realization as she was living this life, she was like, I'm in the wrong movie. Like, I feel like I'm supposed to create a product that impacts millions of people and makes their lives better and helps women. And I'm just like selling fax machines. And then she had this situation one day where she like had to go to a meeting and she was wearing white slacks and she could see her underwear line, and she was like, oh no, that's not professional, and she didn't have time to change. And so she just ended up grabbing her nylons, cutting off the feet, the bottom half, and just pulling on the top half of the nylons, and it covered up the panty line. And she went to the meeting, and then that's where she got the idea for Spanx. And when you hear her tell this story and all the years that came after and all the challenges she faced and how no one would take her seriously and no manufacturer would make a prototype, and she had to convince the buyers at Nordstrom to even get her product in, and then she called all of her friends and asked them to go buy the product so that the buyers would think there was huge demand and that she would like pay back her friends for buying the product. She tells this amazing story with so much honesty and so much realness. And it's totally an appropriate level because it's the real story of how she, over like 2 decades, built this incredible brand and company and, all this money and empowerment. She's honest, and it's so interesting. And I never forget the story. And I always think of Sarah as one of like the most honest, helpful, business mentors for women, for anyone, but specifically for women. She's a real icon. Because she's honest about the process of what it took from her at each step of the way, and the pitfalls and the triumphs and everything she had to do to create that company. She's honest, and it's really interesting. So that's my tip today to whether you're a guest or you're a host in a podcast episode. If you want to be really interesting, be honest. That doesn't mean you need to be offensive. That doesn't mean you need to say crazy stuff or be really like extreme in your views. We're not talking sensational. We're not talking overly vulnerable or inappropriately like sharing to a level that's not appropriate for the context. We're saying when you have a moment or you're telling a story or you're sharing something or explaining a concept on a show, being honest is always interesting. So err on the side of that. Okay, that's our tip for this week. Be sure to subscribe to our channel. We're going to be bringing you new videos this whole fall. And we would love to hear your comments. If you want to know more, or if you have a question or a topic for a video, we are happy to address that.